Good morning, everyone. This is Tom Wilder with the North Carolina Department of Labor, and welcome to the Hazard Communication webinar. We have a lot of people signed up for the class today, and a lot of people are still signing in. But today I want to go over our ground rules so we can get everybody straight and ready to go. Our webinar today is scheduled for an hour and a half, but regardless of the length, you'll receive 1.5 hours credit, which you can use for certifications such as MESH. Again, my name is Tom Wilder. A lot of you already know me. I've been with the Department of Labor about 6 years, and prior to that, I worked 28 years in various safety training and quality management positions in the textile, machine assembly, and pharmaceutical industries. And most of those years were in the pharmaceutical manufacturing, from which I'm now retired. So today in our session, I may give you some examples from pharmaceuticals because that's where I spent most of my career. And if you need more information after the webinar, you can go to labor.nc.gov or OSHA.gov for more information. Now, for people that are new to Webinado and to our webinars, we got to go through our logistics. So look around your work area and try to limit any distractions. So if you got an office, you might want to close your office door or turn phones off. If you're in a cubicle, you probably want to use headphones and put up a do not disturb note. Secondly, our tool that we're using today, Webinado, you'll see our PowerPoint slides in the center of the screen. I'll advance those as we go through the class. And in the bottom left of the screen, you'll see an emoji, but due to the size of our class, I will not be using the emoji because once everybody signs on, there'll be more people than I can see on my screen. So we're not using the emoji today, but we will be using the chat box, which is at the bottom of the screen. And I know a lot of you have said good morning and you typed in chat. So if you got questions or comments, type them into the chat box and I'll be looking at those as we go through the webinar. Thirdly, you must attend at least 80% of the time to receive credit. We may not go an hour and a half, but after the webinar, I'll look at the records and make sure that you've attended at least 80% of the time because you'll need that to get credit. And we can't give credit to anybody who's not registered and logged in. So if you have people sitting around you that aren't registered, only the person that's registered will get credit. Certificates are processed once a month, and you should receive it electronically within 3 weeks. Otherwise, give us a call. So it looks like all our logistics are set. So we're ready to go with HAZCOM. So a lot of you that have been around have noticed that HAZCOM standard's been around for a while. Let me go ahead and ask you a question to get us going. What year did the Hazard Communication Standard start? What year did HAZCOM all begin? What year was that? Somebody can type in the answer there. 1910. That's a funny answer, but it wasn't at 1910. You know, OSHA was formed in 1970. So any other guesses about when? 1983, Casey, you're right. Janie, 1980 is a good answer. Those other answers are good, but it's actually 1983. And some of the folks that are on the webinar, like me, were around since the beginning of this standard. So in the beginning, they talked about it being the right to know. But when this standard was revised in 2012, Federal OSHA said they wanted to go to the right to understand. You can know something but not understand it. So right to understand is the focus right now of the new revised 2012 standard. Now I notice Randy does not have any sound yet. How's everybody on sound? Go ahead and let me know if your sound is okay. Okay. So let me, Randy's having a problem with this sound. Randy, the sound issue is on your end. Okay. All right. So we talked about the HAZCOM standard starting in 1983 and going through a major revision in 2012. And like I said, we want employees that are exposed or potentially exposed to hazardous chemicals to understand what they're working with or around. Now, one important note about today's webinar is I'm going to be focused primarily on chemical users as related to the requirements. So if you're a chemical manufacturer or distributor, you have a lot more that you need to know. And a lot of that's covered in the appendices in the standard. But again, we're going to be focusing mainly on users today. Now, let me go ahead and ask you another question. If you were being inspected by OSHA, what elements would they be looking for in your HAZCOM program? So if you can type in some things that OSHA would be looking for if they inspected you, what would they be looking for? Okay, safety data sheets. There you go. Great. All right. Written plan or written program. Labels. So that would be your vendor labels and your secondary labels. Training. Right. Training program. A site-specific training program. Okay. So I'm going to make sure that I've got everything. That looks, oh, there's one thing that you haven't mentioned. We've talked about training and written program and safety data sheets and labels. Okay, Trey, that's a great answer. Now you said chemical inventory. Now inventory would suffice, but they're looking for a chemical list. So it doesn't have to be necessarily an inventory showing the amounts that you have of everything, but you are required by the standard to have a chemical list. List of what you have in your workplace. So it would be called a chemical list. Now inventory is more fancy. If you want to do that, that's fine. Well, good. That kind of got us started. And one thing I also want to do before we get going too far is I want to do a couple of instant polls. And the first question I want to ask is your experience level with this topic. What is your experience level with HAZCOM? So we want to go ahead and start that poll. What is your experience level with HAZCOM? Okay, we've got a lot of beginners and a lot of intermediate folks out there with HAZCOM, and I've got a couple of advanced. And there are still several people who haven't signed on to the webinar based on our numbers, or you're at least not responding to the poll. But this is showing us that we have a diversity in experience. So for your intermediate and advanced folks, some of the things I'm going to tell you today, you already know, you've known for a while. So we do have a diversity of experience, and I like having the advanced students in here too, because you might have some great questions or comments for us as we go along. So I'm going to go ahead and stop that poll and close it. And now I want to do one more poll. And this one's going to be professional safety experience. How many years of professional safety experience do you have? Let's see what our experience levels look like. Okay, and it's pretty spread out, pretty across the board. We've got some new folks with less than a year. Right now we have 11 with 1 to 5, and 6 from 5 to 10, and 6 for greater than 10 years. So again, we have some veterans with the topic and some rookies with the topic, and we have some veterans and rookies as far as the experience in the safety field that you have. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop that poll and close it. Okay, looks like I've got a couple of comments. Okay, Michelle says, I can't see other comments or slides on the poll. Now you should be able to see all the comments if you scroll down to the bottom of your screen. Sometimes the chat is cut off. Hopefully that's not the case with you, but you should be able to see everybody's comments. The poll, I did open up the poll, and you may, You may have a device. Oh, I see. Michelle, it looks like you're using a mobile device. So any of you that are using mobile devices, we recommend to log on with a PC, a computer. Sometimes with phones and tablets, you might not hear the audio or see my slides. So if you're on a mobile device right now, you might have some issues, and I might recommend that you go ahead and get out of the webinar and log back in on a computer, because we know that there's some technical issues with the mobile devices. And one thing I can see on my end, when I look at the attendee list, I can see if you're using a mobile device because there's a little icon that shows mobile device. Okay, now we have a question from Jennifer. Can your safety data sheet table of contents be your chemical list? Well, your safety data sheet table of contents can be your chemical list if it includes all your chemicals. So if that's comprehensive and kept up to date, I mean, you could use that as your chemical list. You might have a few pages on the table of contents. That works, as long as you can produce a chemical list for your compliance officer or your insurance auditor or your corporate safety auditor, whoever comes in looking at your program. They're going to ask for your chemical list, and you just need to be able to produce that. Okay, now let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Today we're going to cover the purpose of HazCom in the workplace. Why are we doing this? The role of management employees, general requirements for hazards, and requirements for an effective program. So we want you to have a program, and we also want it to be effective. And of course, with the standard, the companies that produce these chemicals, they're required to classify those chemicals and communicate that information to their customers, the employers and employees. So within HazCom, everything is classified. And the manufacturers or importers that make or distribute these chemicals, they've got to distribute this information to you. So they have to transmit the information. Pretty straightforward so far. And now the information that you give to your employees, you're going to talk about to them about your HazCom program, and you're going to talk about labels. Now, what are the two types of labels they're going to look at? What are two label types? But go ahead and let you type in. Labels. Two types of labels. Or the two categories of labels, we might say. Okay, Robert, secondary container labels. And Trey said primary and secondary. So primary would be your vendor label. So when you receive chemicals at your facility, those are the vendor labels, and the OSHA has requirements for those. And then when you transfer chemicals to a secondary container like a spray bottle or bucket, that's called a secondary containers. So when you're training your employees on labels, make sure they understand the difference between your primary and secondary labels and what the requirements are for each. And we're going to cover that later today. Now, safety data sheets, you have to have those. You have to keep those current. And you can have those in paper or electronic form. We'll talk more about that later. And you're going to have information and training. So this standard applies to chemicals known to be present in your workplace. Now, if a chemical is not hazardous, it's not going to be within the scope of the standard. So it has to be a hazardous chemical. And then you have to think, do your employees have the potential to be exposed under normal business conditions or in an emergency? Now we got a little picture here. There's actually a little toy fork truck, and there's a drum, a little toy drum, and there's a little pretend spill that we took a picture of. So you got a forklift moving a drum of chemical and the drum fell off and spilled chemical onto the floor. So that could be acid or base. It could be all kinds of stuff in that chemical. So that would be a foreseeable emergency. You're transporting chemicals and you knock the drum over, or you punctured a drum with a fork of a forklift. So that would be a chemical spill. That would be an emergency. Okay, now this slide talks about laboratories. Now, early in my pharmaceutical career, I was a chemist in the laboratory. So for years, for laboratories, you're not going to remove the labels off your chemicals that you receive. You're going to leave the labels on there. That's a requirement. You're going to maintain the safety data sheets and make them available. And you're going to provide information and training. Now here's where the standard gets confusing. It says accept location and availability of the HAZCOM program. Well, the first time I saw that in the standard, I thought, that is really confusing. Why would you not want your lab people to know about the location and availability of the HAZCOM program? Now, what I want to tell you now is how OSHA looks at laboratories. Laboratories have like two categories. You've got research laboratories, and then you got production support laboratories. So you might be in a manufacturing plant that makes a product, and all the lab does is test raw materials, intermediate samples, and finished product samples. They don't do any research. They don't do anything else special. This is a regular production support lab. Now they're going to have to know the location and availability of the HAZCOM program. That's just a regular production support program. Now, a research lab is kind of like what the standard's talking about when they say labs. If you have a research laboratory where it's not just production support, you're doing special studies and research, you're going to be required to have a chemical hygiene plan. And that's another standard, chemical hygiene. And that's 1450 in the standard, I believe, 1910, and let me make sure I verify that. That's 1910.1450, and it's called Occupational Exposure to Hazardous Chemicals in Laboratories. So if you're in a regular production support lab, that does not apply to you. If your lab goes beyond production support, does special studies and research, then you're going to, not only are you going to be required to be covering certain HAZCOM things, but you're going to fall under that other standard. So when this says accept location and availability of the HAZCOM program, that would be like for a research lab where they have to have their chemical hygiene plan, which talks about the safety of workers in research laboratories, essentially. So again, that's the requirements for labs. And also, it also says something about shipping chemicals. If you're a lab and you ship chemicals, you have to properly label your containers. And if that chemical is hazardous, you have to create a safety data sheet. So if you're going to have to do all that, you're going to have to go into the appendices of the OSHA standard. You got a lot of work to do. Okay, that's about labs. Now, if you work for a company where all you do is warehouse chemicals in sealed containers, drums or other containers, you don't use the chemicals, you don't do anything with them, you're just a warehouse, you receive, store, and ship chemicals. Now, if that's the case, this slide applies to you. You're not going to mess with any of the labeling on your chemical containers. You're going to maintain the safety data sheets, make those accessible, and you're going to provide training. And in that case, you're not even going to have a written HAZCOM program. But I don't think I've ever seen any kind of facility that didn't have other chemicals around we had housekeeping people or other people are using chemicals that didn't trigger the entire HAZCOM program. So these are some exceptions for places like warehouses, but if you have other activities involving chemicals that are hazardous, that's going to trigger the whole HAZCOM program. So, and again, in the warehouse, if you have a spill or leak, you're going to train people on how to handle all of that. Okay, let me take just a minute and see if y'all have any questions or comments, or if you're good to go. How are we doing? Any questions or comments, or are we good to go? Are you still awake? Okay, looks like we're good to go. And I'm watching the chat as we go through and make sure we don't miss any questions or comments. Okay, now this slide here talks about labeling exemptions. So you can see all these different types of chemicals where they're regulated by other government agencies. Pesticides, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. And you see the other agencies beside these, like the Food and Drug Administration, the Consumer Product Safety Act. So if you have these other types of products, they're not going to be labeled per the OSHA HAZCOM standard. They're going to be labeled per the standard that we're talking about on this slide. So like consumer products, if you brought a product from home to the workplace that was a chemical, it would not be labeled by HAZCOM standards. It would be labeled by consumer product standard. Okay, we've got a great question. And this is one that we're going to get into a little bit more later, but we'll go ahead and talk about it now. Do household cleaners require a safety data sheet? Okay, now one of our favorite answers is it depends. Now, let's just say you work in an office, and I'm getting some great comments here. Let's say you work in an office and you bring Windex in to your office from home. You bring a spray bottle of Windex in from home, and you're using it the same way a homeowner would use it, and you're using it in the same amounts in the same fashion as a homeowner. Well, that Windex is not going to have to be part of your HAZCOM program. It doesn't have to be on your list. It doesn't have to have a safety data sheet if you use it in the same amounts in the same fashion as a consumer. But, like Deborah says here, it depends on who's using them. If you got somebody's job that requires them to use Windex and they're cleaning the whole building and they're using large amounts, like Donna says, the hotel industry, then you're going to have it on your list and have it as part of your program. So there's an exemption for consumer products. So if you bring something in, you're using it the same way in the same amount as a consumer, and it's not part of your job, then it would be exempt. But if it's used in a job in large quantities and all, it would be part of your program, and it would require a safety data sheet. Okay, we can talk more about that if you want to later. Now, this is the exemptions for the standard. It doesn't apply to hazardous waste and substances. Of course, other agencies, of course, are looking at that, like EPA and DEQ. Tobacco products, wood products, articles. Articles would be like a table. You know, a table is made up of chemicals. I mean, everything's made up of elements, and there's chemistry involved, but it's an article. Tables and chairs are articles. Food and alcoholic beverages and drugs and drug products are exempt. Now, if you work in a company that manufactures drug products, if it's in its final form and there's no exposure to the employees for handling it, it's exempt. In the process, if there's any exposure from the drug or any of the ingredients to the workers that are handling it, then it would be part of the program. So it's one of those, it depends. Okay, Now, wood products. Here we got wood products. Um, that's another interesting one. Let's say you're a construction company and you put up fiber cement board siding. You install siding on houses, and that siding is kind of a wood product. It's a mixture of cement and other ingredients to make a product. And if I bought a plank as a consumer, the company's not going to give me a safety data sheet typically. But if I'm a contractor and I'm cutting that siding and releasing silica, if I'm cutting or breaking that product up in a way to create a hazard, a chemical hazard, then that's going to require a safety data sheet. That's going to require HAZCOM. So it just depends on what you're doing with some of these products as to whether it's covered in the standard or not. Okay, what about pressure treated wood products? Again, I know they've changed the chemicals they use to preserve that wood, but if by the cutting and all you could have exposure, then I would say yes. I'm talking about employers, I'm not talking about homeowners. But if you're an employer, you're using pressure treated lumber and it's treated with a chemical that's hazardous that could be released, then you're going to need a safety data sheet for that, and that would be part of your HAZCOM program. Okay. Now, again, exemptions, cosmetics, consumer products, nuisance particulates, radiation, and biological hazards like bacteria, like tuberculosis, that sort of hazard, not part of the standard. But again, the consumer products, we get a lot of questions on consumer products. Again, the rule is if you use them the same way a homeowner would use them, in the same amounts and the same levels of exposure, it's exempt from your program. If you use it in large quantities or as part of a full-time job, it could very well be part of your program. Good examples again are Windex, bleach like Clorox, those types of products. Again, it depends on how they're used. Okay, so you've already named the elements at the beginning of the webinar that auditors or inspectors would be looking for. And now those chemicals are going to have to be classified by the manufacturer. But then those other elements you've already named as being required elements in the program. Okay, Matthew, essentially if we have cleaning materials in our break room, we would not need a safety data sheet, correct? Okay, Matthew, who are those cleaning materials for? Go ahead and ask you a question. Who uses those? Okay, Matthew's typing. Like washing dishes or wiping down the tabletop. Okay. Like I said, if you have a break room or lunch room where somebody brings in some dishwashing liquid or something like that, if that's just for employees to use just like they use at home, it's not the job of somebody to wash everybody's dishes all day. It's not, housekeeping doesn't have to do that. If it's just people doing what they do at home or wiping down a tabletop, that would be exempt from HAZCOM. Now let me go ahead and note that there are a lot of employers out there that are very strict about their HAZCOM program. So do whatever your company requires. Some companies say, we know that OSHA exempts stuff, we don't exempt anything. So anything that's a chemical in this building that's hazardous is going to be part of our program. So I know there's some school systems and other employers that try to do that. I'm not always the biggest fan of that because then you're getting into whiteout. The biggest fan of that because then you're getting into whiteout, some other things that might be around furniture polish for somebody's desk. you're always trying to keep up with all these odd and end personal items that people have that are not really posing a hazard to anybody. So again, I'm telling you what the HAZCOM standard requires. And again, your company or employer may go well beyond that. And if they do, then you're going to need to do what your company says. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. Definitions in the standard, they talk about chemicals, a substance or mixture of substances or substances, elements in their compound in the natural state, or obtained by production process. They're not exactly my favorite definitions, but those are the ones in the standard, and that's why we have this slide there. Now, somebody says we've got hazardous chemicals in our workplace. So what is that saying? This chemical has one or more of the characteristics in this list. It's a physical hazard. It could be something that could be flammable, it could burn, it could explode. It could eat through metal if I spilled it on metal. It could be a health hazard. It could cause cancer or create problems with different organs in our body or our skin. It could be something dangerous to breathe in. It could be an asphyxiant that displaces oxygen. Or it could be combustible dust, self-igniting gas, or hazard not otherwise classified. Now, one thing that I think is really funny, and I get a little bit of humor from the HAZCOM standard in some of the stuff that's written. Hazard not otherwise classified, that's HNOC. I call that the junk drawer for hazardous chemicals. A company's created a chemical and it doesn't fit in any of the classifications, so we throw it in the hazardous chemical junk drawer, and we call it a hazard not otherwise classified. So something that's dangerous, but it doesn't really fit with anything else. So if you hear somebody talking about that, then you'll know what they're talking about. Now, starting off with the physical hazards, let's look at the picture. I know that's really tiny. Now, what you can do, you can maximize your slide with the little maximize. Looks like a little window, looks like a picture frame. If you click on that, it's going to make your slide bigger. But if you do that, you're going to knock your chat out. So you may want to minimize it after you maximize it. But that picture there, what is the hazard? What's wrong there? That's right. The cylinders are not secured, not chained, not stored properly, and they may not even be properly segregated. So that's a pretty bad hazard, and this is one of the compliance pictures that we get from our compliance officers. When they go to a site and they see a hazard or potential hazard, they'll take a picture of it. This is a really good picture of cylinders. And we always tell people if a cylinder gets knocked over and somehow that valve shears off, that cylinder will become a rocket. Now, let me ask this. What if the cylinder has compressed air in it? It has compressed air. Now, air typically is not hazardous. But if you have a cylinder of compressed air, is that a hazardous chemical? Okay, the answer is yes. Thanks, Deborah. The answer is yes. It's not that the contents are hazardous, but anything that you compress in a cylinder or is compressed can be a hazard. Because if one of those cylinders can become a rocket, then I'm concerned about that. So, physical hazards, you see the list. Is it explosive? Now, a lot of companies, they don't receive explosives like dynamite. You know, they don't have explosives coming in the door. But, you know, chemicals can create explosive atmospheres like flammable liquids, like alcohols, acetone, ether, those sorts of things can create explosive atmospheres. Oxidizers are highly reactive chemicals. Most of them release oxygen, but chlorine gas is also an oxidizer, and is, again, highly reactive. Self-reactive, pyrophoric, can easily start on, actually catch on fire. Self-heating. Peroxides. Peroxides are constantly releasing oxygen. So would you have any of that at your home? Do you have any peroxides at your home? Any of you have any peroxides at home? Yes. What is that? Yeah, let's see, a lot of yeses. Now, what is that peroxide that you have at home? Somebody go ahead and name it. I think we've all agreed, yeah. Okay, hydrogen. Right, hydrogen peroxide. Now, what you have at home, it releases oxygen. It's an oxidizer. But there's usually a big difference between the hydrogen peroxide that you have at home and the industrial strength peroxide that a manufacturing plant might have. Another example, when I was in the pharmaceutical industry, we had sodium hypochlorite, which is bleach, but we had a super strong bleach solutions that was way stronger than what you'd buy in the grocery store. But bleach is still hazardous. So again, corrosion to metal, gas under pressure, emits flammable gas, or it is flammable. Now, for those of you who've been around for a while, one of the biggest changes in the HAZCOM standard is the classification of flammable liquids. That has changed tremendously. Through global harmonization, the definition of flammable is now consistent, and in the old days it wasn't. It used to be an OSHA definition, an EPA and DOT definition, and other countries defined it differently. Now all flammables are defined the same way. So if you deal with flammables, you need to do a little bit of learning on your own about the different categories of flammable liquids. And remember that classifications of categories of combustible liquid's pretty much gone. Combustible used to be like, it's kind of like a describer now, but we used to categorize something as combustible liquid. Fuel oil number 2, diesel fuel, those used to be considered combustible liquids. Now all of them are different classifications of flammable liquids. Okay. Health hazard. The chemical you're working with could make you sick or do something to you right away, like acute. It could affect your skin. It could eat in your skin or irritate it, cause eye damage. If you breathe it in, it's bad for you. Or it can cause genetic effects, cause cancer, it could cause reproductive issues, or be specific to target organs in your body. It can affect any organ of your body, like skin's a simple example of an organ. A lot of times we don't think about our skin being an organ. But it could affect your kidneys or liver, or it could be an aspiration hazard. If I'm breathing something in, it can be hazardous to us. Now, we have a picture of an aspiration hazard to the right. Now that's, again, a little tiny picture. What is this guy over there in the right doing? What is he doing? I guess it's he. I can't tell. He or she's in a suit. What is that person doing? Okay, he's blowing insulation, but it's actually foam insulation, spraying foam insulation. Now, he or she's in protective gear, and it probably has a supply airline respirator. I can't really see everything from this picture. But what is the danger in spray foam insulation? It's a health hazard. It's an OSHA health hazard. Spray foam insulation contains, this is like a bun. Okay. Now that person may be in a confined space and attic. I'm looking for the word that starts with I. I. If you can get it. Okay, still see some people typing. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and give it to you. Okay, Trevor, you got it. Yeah, isocyanates. So isocyanates, if somebody's chronically exposed, causes isocyanate, essentially asthma, and continued repeated exposure can actually kill somebody if they develop more and more higher and higher levels of this asthma caused by isocyanates. So if somebody's spraying a foam insulation in your house at home, and you got somebody in the attic that's got all this gear on, the lesson would be you don't need to be in the building. You don't need to be in that house. You don't just because you're downstairs doesn't mean you're safe. So this is an aspiration hazard right here. Okay, so Trevor, you get the gold star for sure for naming isocyanates. So I'm going to send you a virtual prize right across the air right now. Hope you receive it right now. A virtual prize. Okay, now pyrophoric gas, like the slide says, it's a self-igniting gas that ignites at a low temperature, like argon gas. Okay. Asphyxiant, so hard to say, asphyxiant, is something that displaces oxygen. Now, in the air we breathe, we know that it has nitrogen in it. But if I was in a room and there was a nitrogen bottle in there and somebody just turned it on, eventually it could displace all the oxygen in the room and kill me. Now, there have been deaths nationally in North Carolina over the years in confined spaces where nitrogen gas somehow got introduced into confined space with somebody working in there. So nitrogen can be very dangerous. Now, carbon monoxide does the same thing. It displaces oxygen. But again, as an element, nitrogen is a great example. Okay, now here's my favorite. This is what I call the junk drawer. And you won't see junk drawer in the standard. That's just my slang term for HNOC. The manufacturer of the chemical classified this chemical or tried to. They said it just doesn't fit in any of these classes, so we're gonna put it in the HNOC classification. It's dangerous, but it doesn't fit with the others. So when the companies create these chemicals or synthesize them, they're going to determine the class it goes into, and then you've got categories. Now this is where a lot of employees get confused, and we don't want to confuse you today. Because if you look in the appendix of the OSHA standard for HAZCOM, it starts talking about all the categories. And the thing about categories is that a low category number like a 1 is very dangerous. Now, throughout the years, you've been learning that something that was a 4 was dangerous. So what's on your chemical label, those numbers for HMIS and NFPA, those numbers, a 1 is pretty safe. A 0 has no hazard. A 1 is pretty safe, and a 4 is dangerous. But when you look in the classification section of the standard in the appendices, the low numbers are bad. So all we're talking about is classification numbers. So if you're training people on HAZCOM, I would just tell people that you've got categories of these classes, and that 1s are bad and numbers higher than 1 are safer. But I wouldn't go into that at all or very little, because you're going to confuse the heck out of people. And I'm going to show you how in a second. Now that's in appendices A and B. And the manufacturers can rely on SDSs for individual ingredients. And of course, employers are not required to classify chemicals. So if I was you and I'm training rank and file employees on HAZCOM, unless they're a chemical manufacturer or specialist, I wouldn't go into the appendices very much because a lot of people will confuse the heck out of them. So Here's an example. Now with our health hazards, you see classes on the left like acute toxicity, and it's got 1 through 4. Well, if a chemical is acute toxicity 1, that stuff is deadly, and it wouldn't take much of that stuff to kill me. If it was a 4, it's still toxic, but it would take a lot more exposure for the same effect, higher dose and more exposure. So just to show you what the table looks like, and STOT is single target organ toxicity, like toxicity to a particular organ. Okay, so there's a category table. And here's one for that was health. This is physical hazards. So like I said, there are peroxides. You got type A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So in this case, an A is way more dangerous than a G. Flammable liquids. You got 1, 2, 3, 4. A 1 is your most flammable with the lowest boiling point. Like a category 1 would be something like ether. Ether would be a category 1 flammable liquid. So again, I'm just showing you what these appendices have in them. And for the rank and file employees, I wouldn't worry them too much with this, because unless they're a chemist or they work in a lab, a lot of this is going to confuse the heck out of them. Okay, now you're going to have a written program if you have potential exposures to hazardous chemicals in your workplace. And the people that need to look at that are, of course, compliance officers from OSHA, or you may have insurance auditors or corporate safety auditors. Anybody coming in to audit you, they want to look at that written program. In other words, what are you doing with your employees to protect them from potential exposure to hazardous chemicals? And that written program needs to be used, it needs to be understood by employees, and it needs to be available to them. We've had stories from compliance officers. They'll go in to do an inspection, and they'll say, if you got your written program, and they will literally be breaking the plastic off the written program that the consultant put together for them. They hired a consultant to put it together, and they wrapped it in plastic, and the employer had not even broken the plastic off of it. And they say, well, have your employees ever seen this? Have they been trained on it? That's not good. Okay, Randy, you got a question that you've had in there for a while. You said have an example of product. Are you asking me a question? Have an example of product. So if that's something you want me to answer, you need to clarify that a little bit for me. Okay. That doesn't fit graphs. Oh, okay. That's a great question. And right now, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that would be an HNO-C chemical. And if I can come up with one, within a reasonable amount of time, I'll send it to the class. But I know that they exist. I don't think OSHA would create that if it didn't exist. But again, a great question. I need, next time I do this webinar, I need to have an example of that, because I probably asked the same question. Okay. Now, your written program is going to talk about how you deal with labels. You're going to say that you're not going to bother the vendor labels that come in. And then when you label your secondary containers, this is how we label them. It's going to talk about how you maintain your safety data sheets. Are they in paper or electronic form? And it's going to say if the power goes down or a computer goes down, how can you retrieve that information within a reasonable time. You're going to talk about how you convey information and how do you train your employees. And it's going to refer to the list of chemicals that you have. Now, I will tell you one mistake a lot of companies make. Let's say you work for a big company and you hire a new person, they go through new hire week, and they go through your HAZCOM training. general HAZCOM training, kind of like what we're doing today. But this is company specific. When you send your workers to their department, maintenance, production, packaging, manufacturing, wherever, then you need to go further with them. Now, a lot of HR departments, they'll have a form put together, a department orientation form. And if there are some really weird, dangerous chemicals out there in that department that they need to know more about, you need to train them on that and document it. So don't just give people general HAZCOM training and let them go to some area not to learn about something that they work with that can be very dangerous. That would be area-specific chemical. Okay, now your program can also talk about non-routine tasks. There may be something in your company that you do only once a year. Now, in a pharmaceutical plant, what we used to do, we made our own pharmaceutical water, and we called that water for injection. And that water was sanitized, and it went through a stainless steel loop, and we maintained it at 80 degrees centigrade or Celsius. Now, what we had to do with this distribution system is we had to treat it with chemicals. We had to do I am totally drawing a blank. We're having to essentially flush the system with chemicals to maintain our system once a year, and that was something that people didn't do routinely. So we had to train them how to work with those particular chemicals, acids and bases. And so again, if there's something that people do not routinely, you might need a special procedure like a job safety analysis or other procedure to go back to tell people how to do that. And like this says, cleaning a reactor vessel. And also, if you have unlabeled pipes in your workplace with chemicals in them, tell your employees about those. Now, a lot of you are going to label those pipes anyway, but there are some cases where HAZCOM is going to exempt you from that, but process safety management won't, so it depends. So pipes. Okay, multi-employer work sites. So you always want to make sure that people have ways to access the safety data sheets and how to operate in emergencies. And also, if you bring other contractors or other employees to your work sites, make sure that they know how to understand your labeling systems that you're using, because there are a lot of different ways to label chemicals. If you have employees because there are a lot of different ways to label chemicals. If you have employees that travel between workplaces, you can keep a HAZCOM program at a primary workplace facility as long as it's accessible, readily accessible. Labels. Now we're moving along and talking about, of course, labels. This picture here shows a vendor label for Camphor. And it has the signal word, precautionary statements, and pictograms, all that on the label. So again, and you see the label defined, something that's going to be attached to your chemical from the manufacturer. So each of those labels have to have an identifier. What is this chemical? Sulfuric acid, danger, signal word, hazard statements, pictograms, precautionary statements, and the name and address of the manufacturer or distributor. That all has to be on the label. Now these labels are either going to have, in some cases, danger or warning. If you see danger, that's the highest level of risk with a chemical. So a chemical that has danger on it is essentially more dangerous than a chemical that has just the word warning. So that's danger versus warning. And you're going to see pictograms, these little pictograms on there. and hazard statements like harmful if inhaled. Now, these little pictograms and signal words and statements at the bottom of this slide, these are all talking about toxicity. If you had a toxicity of 1, you would see a skull and crossbone, danger, fatal if inhaled. If it was a 2, same thing. If it's a 3, it would be danger, but it would be toxic if inhaled. If it was a 4, it would go to an exclamation point, warning, harmful if inhaled. So this is how the manufacturers determine what hazard statements to put on, what kind of pictogram, what to put on there. That's all in the appendices, and that's just so you know. As a consumer, from a company perspective, you just need to understand what a hazard statement is, and if you read it, again, what it means. That's something you cover in your training. Pictogram. It's a little symbol plus graphics that tell us about the classification of the chemical. And 8 of them are covered by OSHA and 1's covered by EPA. This is our environmental one. The little the fish in the plant. I guess there's dead fish and dead plant. Anyway, aquatic toxicity. All the other ones are covered by OSHA. Now, one thing I will say, I like 7 out of the 8 pictograms. There's one of them I'm not the biggest fan of. Most of those, if you look at the little symbol or picture or graphic on there, okay, I've got this health hazard. It looks like a little explosion or something happening in the body. Okay, I could get that. The flame for flammable, the gas cylinder for gas, corrosive liquids eat through metal or skin, okay. Oxidizer, flame over a burning O, okay. Exploding bombs, and skull and crossbones for toxicity. But the one that's the least clear is the exclamation mark. If I just see an exclamation mark, that means it can be an irritant sensitizer, or it could be harmfully toxic. It could be narcotic, irritant, and hazardous to ozone layer. Well, what you see here is a mixture of hazards that aren't necessarily related to each other. So it's almost like the exclamation point, it's almost like the junk drawer itself, because I've got irritant and acute toxicity harmful in under the same pictogram. Now, if you go down to skull and crossbones, acute toxicity fatal or toxic. So your most poisonous chemicals are going to get a skull and crossbone. If it's the least poisonous, it's going to get an exclamation mark. I would have liked it better if they'd worked that out a little bit better. But anyway, I know all of you, if you worked in the year 2013, you had to be trained on what all these pictograms meant in 2013, in the year 2013. And you can see all the describers under each one. Okay. Now, precautionary statement, you see lots of statements that could be on these chemicals. Keep away from heat sparks. Do not subject to shock. Wear face protection. Just simple examples. And all this information is harmonized worldwide. And of course, here in the United States, all that has to be in English, required to be in English. And make sure that information does not conflict with transportation or DOT labels. Now, with global harmonization, we should be more closely aligned with DOT labels than we ever have been in the past. And there's your label example for camphor. What is it? Camphor, the pictograms, hazard statements, precautionary statements, warning, and name and address of the company that produced this chemical or manufactured it. Now, workplace labeling. This is something I want to spend a few minutes with for sure. Now, workplace labeling means that I've got a chemical and I've transferred that chemical to a secondary container, like that spray bottle. Now, the rules for that are in the OSHA standard, just like is on this slide, 1910-1200 F6. So what OSHA says, if you transfer a chemical to a spray bottle or a bucket or some other container, you can put everything that's on the label for the chemical, you know, the vendor label. If you have another copy or a smaller version of that they give you to stick on containers, you can take a copy of a vendor label and attach it to your container. That's one thing you can do. The exact vendor label, just put a small version on there. Now, a lot of companies don't want to do that because if you miniaturize that vendor label, all the writing would be so small you can't even hardly read it. But you could do that if you'd like. Or, here's a lot of flexibility. Product identifier with words, pictures, symbols, or combination, which generally tell people about the hazards of the chemicals. Now, if you could make that slide bigger and look at that spray bottle, you're going to see that that is XYZ cleaner. And I've got to see if I can even read it. It's so small. Then it says extremely flammable, and then there's another hazard statement below it. There's a physical and it probably says skin irritant. You got a physical and health hazard and the identifier on that bottle. Now, you as a company, you could clearly and legibly write what is this chemical, print it on there permanently, and you could put the physical and health hazards, you could write those on the chemical container, and you'd be good to go. Now, you might want to put some tape or something over all that so that it doesn't come off or wash or rub off, but that would be compliant with OSHA. Now, there are a lot of companies out there selling labeling systems. Now, those are fine, those are great, and if you got those, again, that's fine. Now, give me some examples of labeling systems that companies use for secondary containers. Go ahead. This is your time to type in. Okay, Deborah. Wow. That was fast. Okay, Deborah has identified the two that are recognized that we see on containers. Now, she said HMIS, or it could be HMIG. HMIS and HMIG are the same. There are two organizations that have rights to those designs. So you might see it as HMIS or HMIG. And you'll have color categories and numbers and protective equipment letters on that label. So it has what is this chemical, what's the number for each hazard, and you would get those numbers from the safety data sheet. The only thing about those labels, it has a personal protective equipment letter, like it might have B, the letter B, which I'm just guessing because I'm not looking at a chart right now. It might want you to wear safety glasses and protective gloves. Well, the container is not telling me that. It's just saying protective equipment B. So if you're using HMIS labels, you need to, throughout your workplace, put those charts up everywhere that shows what a letter A, B, C mean as far as what personal protective equipment they need to wear. That's one of the biggest drawbacks of HMIS. Now, NFPA labels, the NFPA diamond is like HMIS, has numbers 0 to 4 for flammability, health, reactivity, and special precautions. You can use those as long as you have the chemical name, the NFPA diamond on there, and the numbers. There is a little bit of difference between the numbers for HMIS and NFPA. NFPA talks about fire situations, fire scenarios. HMIS doesn't talk about fire scenarios. So sometimes there could be a slight difference between the numbers between those two systems. But you can use NFPA, HMIS, or many of these other systems that these companies sell you that you can print, where you can print these on your printers. But I just want to let you know it can be very simple or it can be complex, but your employee needs to know what is this and what are the hazards. Okay, Deborah's got a comment. Okay, problem is many GHS safety data sheets no longer contain ratings. Okay, now if that's the case and you're using those types of labels, then you need to use a different way of putting those hazards on the container so your employee knows. Okay, I got a question. Are GHS compliant labels okay? Generally speaking, yes. Again, if I look at the container, do I know what it is? It's XYZ cleaner. And is there any way for me to know about the hazards of that chemical? If that's the case, then they are okay. Okay. And Trey says sometimes you can find the numbers in section 16 in the safety data sheet. So if you're using some of those labels that don't have those numbers on them, at least for those chemicals, I would be communicating those hazards differently, because I don't want to put an NFPA label or HMIS label on the chemical and have those spaces blank where the numbers go. So, there are companies out there that sell labels. I used to buy them years ago, and I'd buy a label, it would say acetone, and then it says health hazard, harmful if inhaled, causes dry, cracking skin, flammable, and it was just a regular durable label. Wasn't anything special about it except that it was durable and it had the information on it, and I stuck it on the container. So it doesn't have to be any fancy design as long as it has the information on there you need. Okay, how's everybody on labels now? I know we've gone through a lot today. Is everybody okay? Questions, comments? Okay, good. All right. So let's keep going. We're heading toward the finish line. Now, a lot of you already know if you have an employee transfer a chemical to a spray bottle, and here's a compliance picture. Here was an unlabeled spray bottle that was unattended. If you got chemical in a container, the employee's drawn into that container, that employee cannot leave that container. If it's break time and they're not taking that to break with them, and they're not taking it to lunch with them, then they better be labeling that container. So if it's attended 100% of the time, you use it all that day, as long as it has the employees with it, you're fine. If they leave it, it's not fine, because the employee serves as a warning to somebody around them, says, don't mess with this. This container contains acetone or sulfuric acid or whatever. So again, if you have a container that's controlled, used only by that person within the shift, and it's all used up, you're fine. But again, a lot of companies and organizations go beyond that rule and require labeling at all times of all hazardous chemicals, regardless. But again, there is an exception for those unattended containers. So hopefully that slide's clear to you. If it's not, please ask questions. Okay, safety data sheets. Now, safety data sheets have been around for a long time, ever since the HAZCOM standard came out. And one thing I'll tell you that OSHA came out with a template for a safety data sheets that had about 8 sections in it. And until the year 2012, they were allowing those safety data sheets, or actually material safety data sheets, to be used. What happened is ANSI came up with a 16 section format. So even though there was a requirement for 16 sections, a lot of companies have been using 16 sections for years. So when this new standard came out, a lot of companies were already in line with the new format. About the only thing they did was add pictograms to them, but they had already been using that 16 section format. Okay, so your manufacturers and importers must develop or obtain the safety data sheet, and employers must maintain those for every chemical they have, and it must be in English. And these are all the sections, and I'm not going to read through this. Most of y'all, I'm sure, are familiar with all the different sections of a safety data sheet. Now, if you're a safety professional, a lot of times you'll get somebody from another part of your facility come to you and say, I want to throw away this chemical. Can it go to the landfill? Well, there you're getting into your environmental questions, but those are questions you'll get. And the safety data sheet will say, do not dispose of in a sanitary landfill. This is a hazardous waste. Do not pour down the drain. So you'll see a lot of that good environmental information. And then there's a lot of other good information about respirators, personal protective equipment, all the stuff that you already know about, or other names for a chemical. Hydrochloric acid is known by the brick masons as muriatic acid. Muriatic acid is the same thing as hydrochloric. So in the safety data sheet, you'll see that in the synonyms. Now, I will tell you, I just came back. We talked about non-routine tasks. I was talking about passivation of water systems. The word passivation was escaping me a while ago. So when I was talking about using chemicals, I was talking about passivation. So anyway, we've talked about the sections a little bit. They got to supply these to you with the first shipment, and when these safety data sheets are updated, and make all those readily accessible to employees. Now we're also talking about a big deal here. Now you're going to need a safety data sheet. You're going to need that information in an emergency. So if you're performing first aid at your company and you need information from the safety data sheet, about how quickly do you think you should be able to get that information? I'll let you type that in. How quickly should you be retrieving the information? Okay, Jeff, that's a good answer. 5 minutes. So we'll say 0 to 5 minutes, because there's some exposures where that 5 minutes is super critical for your first aid. So if okay, Phil says should be on hand in the first aid area. Okay, what are you talking about, Phil? What should be on hand? Your safety data sheets. Okay, I see you're typing. Okay, so if you have a safety data sheet information center in your first aid room or first aid area, that's great. But the standard says readily accessible. It doesn't have to be in the same room, but you have to be able to get them quickly. And if you got them electronically, because I've worked for some companies that had that, employees need to be able to get this information quickly. They have to be authorized to get it, and they need to be able to get to the computers or terminals or whatever they need to get to pull that information up. So a lot of times when compliance officers go out, they'll ask employees how do they access their electronic safety data sheets, and if they say it's on the supervisor's computer, but I can't use their computer or I can't get to it, then that would be a problem. Or it's on the computer but it's locked up at night. So, now also the other question would be, if your computer system or power goes down, is there a quick way to access that electronic information? You've got to be able to answer that, because that will happen. So the people that have these all the paper copies, they don't have to worry about that. And like it says, when employees travel between workplaces, it can be kept to the primary workplace, but you still need quick access. Okay, now if you have a medical incident, if you have somebody hurt or injured and there was a chemical involved, uh, we want you to keep that safety data sheet information together, a copy of that with their exposure records, and those must be maintained at least 30 years. And you have to have your affected employee exposure access available to that exposed employee anyway. Okay, training. Okay, we're getting close. We're only about 5 slides away from the end. Now, a lot of times I ask people, I said, how often does your company train people on HazCom? Let me ask you, how often do you train your employees on HazCom? You can go ahead and type in. Okay. Those are all great answers. Now Matthew, I'll give Matthew a gold star. Matthew says annually or whenever there is a change. Okay. Now a lot of the companies I've worked for had initial and annual HazCom training, and that's great. The OSHA standard says that your employee is going to be trained initially and then when chemicals change. So it's initially and then when chemicals change. So you might work for a company where nothing changes for 5 years. Now, in that case, I would not recommend waiting 5 years. Even if something hasn't changed, people get fuzzy on this. They start forgetting what they learned. Train them frequently enough so that their knowledge is fresh on this topic. And annually, those who are doing it annually or whenever things change, that's great. That's the best practice. OSHA again says initially or when the new chemicals arrive or when chemicals change. So that's good. Now, that's good. Now, the information, you're going to train them on what the standard says. Operations in their work area where hazardous chemicals are present. So they may have gone through general training for your company, but your supervisor or lead person's got to cover some of the special chemicals or special hazards in the work area. They're going to need to know where the written program is. They need to know where the list of hazardous chemicals is, and they need to know how to readily access their safety data sheets. Okay. Training. You're also going to put in there in your program, how do employees detect the presence or release of chemicals? In other words, an employee goes in the room, they smell something weird, they need to be communicating, and the safety official at the company or somebody's going to decide whether we have to evacuate. Somebody has to have an answer because it could be a dangerous situation. They need to be taught about all the hazards with your chemicals. Do you have any HNOC chemicals? And tell them about that. How to protect themselves with PPE and the details of your program. Okay. Now, trade secrets. Let me ask you this. Do any of y'all use chemicals in your operations where they don't list the specific ingredients and the amount or percentage of those ingredients are in your chemical? Do any of you have trade secret chemicals? Okay, Robert says I do not. Janie does. Deborah does. Shannon does. Okay, I will tell you that I've worked for a company where I picked up a safety data sheet. Of course, it's a material safety data sheet then, where it says, under ingredients, it says, we consider the ingredients to this product to be a trade secret. That's allowed. But under Right to Know Act, North Carolina law, and federal OSHA says if you're a medical professional, emergency professional, a doctor doing an exposure assessment for an employee, any of these medical or emergency conditions, that if they call that manufacturer, they need to disclose the ingredients and makeup of that chemical in emergency. So again, and the reason some companies do that trade secret thing, is because some of the chemicals I've used in the past in industry, if you know what was in there and the percentages, I mean, you might pay $10 for the chemical, or I could have somebody in the lab make it up in 5 minutes and it costs 50 cents. So some of those special chemicals, they know they're easy to make and copy, or they don't want another company to copy it, so they do the trade secret thing. So anyway, in emergency situations, like this slide says, a physician, emergency room, any of these people, if they call the number, the emergency number for that chemical, they should be able to divulge full information. If it's a non-emergency for medical professionals trying to assess employee exposure, even if it's not an emergency, they have to disclose then as well. Okay, wow, we're finally there. We have covered a ton of material today, and let's go ahead and see if we have any final questions here. And what I'll do after the webinar, I'll look through the chat and make sure that I've covered all the questions. We had one question about our what I call junk drawer chemicals example. If I can find one, if I can find an easy example of one, I'll send it to everybody. If I can't, if you don't get anything from me, it's because I haven't found one yet, but I know they exist. So again, is everybody good to go? I don't see any questions rolling up. Okay. Well, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and officially end the webinar at 11:23, and I'll stay on here just a few more minutes, and in case anybody has any other questions or comments. But y'all have been great today. If you're ready to log off, go ahead. We'll be looking through the reports, and all of you that have been on 80% of the time, of course, will get credit and should get a a certificate certainly within a month if you don't give us a call. So all of you have been great today. You're welcome. Lori, Joshua, Trey, Richard, Caleb. I've had some great students today, and we've covered a very long standard. So I'll put my music back on here for a minute and see if any questions come up. And if none come up in the next 2 or 3 minutes, I'll go ahead and log off. So all of you have a great day. Thanks for attending. This is Tom Wilder. I hope to talk to you again in the near future.
Farmers Insurance knows the difference between a car hitting your bumper and a clown car hitting your bumper.
Sorry about that.
Because we covered it. Click for more.
We are farmers. Bum, 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 bum.
Underwritten by Farmers Truck Fire Insurance Exchanges and Affiliates. Products not available in every state.